There was a giant by the name of Oig, Melech HaBashon. When Oig saw the Jewish people in the desert, he said, I want to destroy the entire Jewish people. He was a giant. Says the Talmud, he lifted up a mountain. Okar Tura, he ripped out a mountain the size of 3 parsi by 3 parsi, which was the size of the camp of Israel. He was about to throw it on top of the Jewish people. A miracle happened that as he's about to throw it, the mountain fell onto his head and went onto his neck. And now he wanted to push off the mountain, says the Gemara. However, his teeth grew out into the mountain and he couldn't move it. He was stuck. That's what the Talmud says. Then Moses, says the Talmud, who was 10 amot high, took an axe of 10 amot high and he jumped 10 amos high and he hit Oig, the giant, on his ankle. Wow. And the ankle was hit by the axe, and then Oig toppled over with the mountain on his head, and he died. This is the miraculous story in the Talmud. Now let us look into the Chumash, into the Parsha of Chukas, and see what the Torah tells us about Oig, and what was Moshe Rabbeinu's dilemma, and what was the response, and what is the lesson to us nowadays. The Torah says, when the Jewish people approached Oig, which was on the date, according to our history books, it was in the year 2488, the 23rd day of Tishrei, right after the holiday of Sukkot. They were about to fight Oig Melech HaBashon. And Moshe Rabbeinu was afraid. He's afraid. God tells Moshe, Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Al tira oisei, do not fear him. Ki biyodcha nesati oisei, I have placed him into your hand. V'chol Amma, his entire nation, Ves Arza, his land, and you can do to him as you wish. Verse 35 says the Torah, Vayaku oisoi, and they smit him. Now, look very carefully at the wording. Vayaku oisoi. In Hebrew, Vayaku is plural. They smit him. They smit him, his children, his nation, and nobody remained. Nobody survived. Now, Rashi, however, interprets the verse differently. Rashi says the following. Join me in the Rashi. Rashi, the final Rashi of the portion. Rashi Lamed Hey, Rashi 35. Vayaku oisoi. And they smit him. Says Rashi, no, do not read they smit him, but rather Moshe haragoi. Moshe alone killed him. How do we know this? How do we know Moshe himself killed him? As the Gemara says in the tractate of Brachos, Baharoya, in the chapter titled Haroya, Nun Dalet Amud Beis, page 54, side 2. And now Rashi quotes the Gemara. Okar Tura bar Telosa Parsi v'chuli. As it says that Oig lifted up a mountain, Okar Tura, that was the size of 3 parsi, v'chuli, etc., etc., etc. Now, what is unique about this Rashi is that even though the verse literally says Vayaku, and they smit him, Rashi interprets it that was Moses, an individual. So we have a problem over here. The verse says they smit him. Rashi comes along and says he smit him. Number one, how does Rashi know that it was only Moshe, not all the Jewish people? Number two, if it was Moshe alone, why then does the verse tell us Vayaku and they smit him? What's the lesson? Furthermore, Rashi is known to be the Pashtun, which means he's the logician of the Torah. He gives a simple interpretation. If he quotes from a Gemara, which already is for an elder student, because a 5-year-old student learns Chumash. You have to be 15 to learn the Talmud. So if he quotes the Talmud, many times he'll say, our rabbi state, or he'll say, as it says in the Gemara. But here Rashi tells us literally it's the Gemara of Brachis in the Tractate of Aroya, and he goes on to say what happened over there, that he lifted up a mountain the size of 3 parsi. Now, if Rashi wants to prove here that Moshe Rabbeinu was the one that actually killed Og, not the nation or the army, but Moses himself single-handedly, why does Rashi quote the Gemara, Okatura, that Og lifted up a mountain? What he should have said was, and Moshe smote him. Like the Gemara follows after and explains what happened and tells us the story, how Moshe Rabbeinu took an axe and he jumped and he hit Og on the ankle. That should have been the proof that Vayaku Oisei is not the plural, but it's the singular, because Moshe Rabbeinu was the one that did it. So why does Rashi bring only the first part of the story, not the latter part of the story, which really is needed to prove his point that Vayaku is not the plural, but is the singular, that Moses himself was the one that killed Og. How does Rashi know that Moshe Rabbeinu, according to the simple interpretation? Now, according to the Talmud has its approach. But Rashi, who takes the literal approach of the Torah, how does he see this in the verse? And the answer is, because in the verse before this, in verse number 34, it says, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, God tells Moses, Al tira oisei, do not fear him. So God is telling this to Moses alone. Moshe, you do not fear him. And as Rashi tells us, why was Moshe afraid? All of a sudden Moses is afraid. The famous Moses who fought against Pharaoh, who fought against the army of Pharaoh, who fought all these major kings. Now he's all of a sudden afraid of one little giant or one big giant. So Rashi tells us what was Moshe Rabbeinu's concern. Moshe was afraid to fight against Og. Why? What happened? Because as Rashi tells us, that Og had a zechus, Og had a merit. What was the merit? The merit takes place 465 years earlier. 465 years earlier. Now, if Og was a giant physically, he also was a giant in years. He lived a long time. 465 years earlier, in the time of Abraham, there was a war, the famous war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. At that time, the 4 kings were more powerful than the 5 kings. And they took Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, and they took him hostage. Vayovayapolit came along, the fugitive. Who was the fugitive? The fugitive was Og. Og was this giant, and he ran away from the war. They almost killed him. And he now ran to Abraham to tell him the news. You should know your nephew was taken hostage. You have to go save him. Avraham Avinu went that time, and he took his servants, Eliezer. A miracle happened. He went and he won the war, and he took back his nephew Lot. So this zechus, this merit that Og went and told Avraham Avinu about his nephew, was the concern that Moshe Rabbeinu had. This merit will protect him. Now it's interesting to note that Og wasn't such a big tzaddik because he had an ulterior motive. Why did he tell Avraham Avinu that his nephew was taken hostage? His objective was, as Rashi tells us, Sarah was a gorgeous woman, and he wanted to marry Sarah. He was hoping Avraham would go to war, fall in battle, he's going to marry Sarah. So even though his motives were not with good intention, but being that his action was important and was good, he now has the merit of Avraham Avinu. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu is afraid. Do I have the power to win him? He has this merit of Abraham. Now it's interesting to note, God tells Moshe, Al tira oisei, you Moses don't fear. Moshe was afraid, says Rashi, not the Jewish people. Why not the Jewish people? Because the Jewish people, number one, believed in Moses. He had prayer, he had strength. They trusted in the leader of the generation, the tzaddik, the Gadol Hador, the Manig Yisrael. They trusted in Moses. But Moshe himself saw things they could not see. A tzaddik has that ability to see things beyond the surface, beyond the physical. And he saw, when he saw Oig, he saw this giant, he saw this wild man, but he also saw a spark of merit in Oig Melech HaBashar. And he was afraid. They were not afraid. But Moshe Rabbeinu himself was afraid. And therefore God has to assure Moses, don't be afraid. And that is why Rashi says, because the Torah tells us, God told Moshe, Al tira oisei, ki biyodcha, in your hand I will give him, your hand in the singular, you must say, vayaku oisei, that they smit him means that Moses was the one that smit him. Moses alone, and not with the help of the rest of Israel. Now, according to the commentaries, the reason it says vayaku oisei in the plural is because in this verse it includes also his sons and the nation. Being that it also includes the sons and the nation, when it came to the war against the sons and the nation, yes, then the Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, did fight that war. But when it came to Oig himself, it was Moses alone who did it. However, the 5-year-old child who was learning Rashi, all of us who are 5 in our hearts and our minds, we're young, we have youthfulness, and we look into the Rashi, we look into the Chumash, we still have the question. And what is the question? It's true, it makes sense that Moshe was the one that killed Oig on his own, but why then does the Torah use the terminology vayaku, which is the plural? What's the message to us? And the answer is, and Rashi hints to this by saying you should look into the tractate of Brachis, into the chapter of Haroya, which talks about Oig Melech HaBashar and lifting up the mountain. Now again, we ask the question, lifting up the mountain is not a proof that Moses killed him. Why does Rashi quote these words? And the answer is as follows. Oig Melech HaBashar, at that moment, when he lifted up the mountain, in truth, he lost the merit. When Moshe Rabbeinu first saw him, he was afraid because he had the merit. But after he lifted up the mountain and he said, I want to destroy the Jewish people, the merit disappeared. And therefore, vayaku, in truth, every single Jew not only had the right, but had the obligation to eliminate and terminate Oig Melech HaBashar. As the Talmud tells us, in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, page 72, side A, if a person comes to kill you, what is the halacha? Says the Torah, Hashkem lahorgoi, you have to get up early in the morning and kill him first. So in truth, the Torah, which is not only a book of history, but primarily the Torah is Torah. Torah means lesson. Is a lesson of how to live our lives. Tells us, vayaku oisai, that the Jewish people had an obligation to eliminate and terminate their enemies. And not to wait till they come into our land and to wait till they send rockets and missiles into our houses. But we have to strike them first in offensive war to make sure that they can no longer lift up their hands against Am Yisrael, the Jewish people. So this is the message of this week's parasha. And this is the insight the Torah is teaching us. And that is that we have to know, Number one, in every generation, there's a Moshe. And when there's a war, the Moshe of that generation is fighting the war for us. He's fighting the war here physically and fighting the war from the heavens spiritually. At the same time, Vayaku, we have to have a strong army. At the same time, Vayaku, we have to go out and fight the enemy. But we have to know that we're together with the Moshe of our generation. And therefore, even if there's an oig, even if there are giants, and they seem to be greater and stronger than us, says God, Al tira oisei, do not fear them. Ki biyodcha nesati oisei, I will give them into your hands. And this parsha falls out the Shabbos in between the third day of Tammuz, which is the passing of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and also the Shabbos before the 12th and 13th of Tammuz, which is the day that the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Jacob J, was released from prison, communist prison, in 1927. Now, on one hand, the third day of Tammuz, the day the Rebbe passed away, we know historically on that day, we spoke about this in the past, many years earlier, that day Joshua, Shemesh begivoin doim, stopped the sun and the moon in Givoy. That was on Gimel Tammuz. So this is a day that we see that the warriors of Israel have the ability not only to fight against the giants, but they have the power to fight against also nature, the sun and the moon. And it's interesting to note that the sun and the moon also refer to the idols and the gods of the nations of the world who serve these idols. Which means it's a time that we have the ability not only to fight a physical war, but also a spiritual war, to influence and inspire the nations of the world to follow in the 7 Noahide laws, and to give up the beliefs in idolatry, but rather to follow one God. And similarly, on the 12th and 13th of Tammuz was a day, in 1927, that Rabbi Jacob J was released from exile and prison. He was put into prison first and then later into exile because of the fact that he opened up yeshivos in Russia, in the former USSR, and it was prohibited in Soviet Russia to teach Jewish children Torah. And yet, the Rebbe created an army of selfless chassidim that went and taught Torah, and many of them were killed. And the next day, there was another teacher to keep Torah and Yiddishkeit alive. In other words, even though you have this giant, you have USSR, or the former USSR, the entire country stating you're not allowed to go and teach children Torah, yet says God to Moses, you should know, Al tira oisei, do not be afraid. You'll have the power to defeat the greatest of all enemies. So therefore, this is a week of tremendous strength for Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people, that we should fight our own green giants, we should fight our own inner giants, those obstacles that we have within our daily life, and we have the ability to overcome the larger giants in the world around us. It's interesting to note that during the Persian Gulf War, there was a Jewish chaplain by the name of Yaakov Goldstein. And he came to the Rebbe and said to the Rebbe, when will the war be over? And the Rebbe said, it'll be over before Purim. And it was over the day before Purim. The point is, all of these wars, God tells us, is in your hands. God gave us the ability to bring peace to the world, to bring an end to war, and we do this through prayer, we do this through Torah study, we do this through charity. So we have the army fighting in Israel, but we need to fight here in America. We need to fight throughout the entire world by davening more, by saying Tehillim, by giving charity, and this is the way, and strengthening our betachin in the tefillah of Moses, in the prayer of Moses, as Rashi tells us. This, no doubt, will bring about the ultimate victory. So we hope and pray that we should go from this exile to the ultimate geula, to the ultimate redemption, with the coming of Mashiach, b'mheira b'meinu, amen. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you have any question, please write it in the comments.